What is the deepest internet rabbit hole you've ever fallen into? A woman once got into an Uber with me, we chatted, and when she left, she told me her first name and her place of work and said, "Come find me." Looking her up felt like stalking her since she didn't have much of an internet presence. Found out why pretty soon. Turns out she was a Columbine shooting survivor. Her name was in the shooter's journal. I even ran across a cached copy of a deleted Tumblr blog that had been tracking all of the girls in that journal. Were they married? How many kids? Where they live? Truly some of the creepiest crap I've seen on the internet about real people. The worst part is I could never tell her I knew all of this. That's actually pretty scary, right? Story 2. A young woman on Reddit said she was going to off herself. Using her post history, I figured out where she lived, where she worked, called and spoke to someone who knew her IRL. They gave me the name of her boyfriend, found his number. Turns out he had broken up with her but still cared, so he went over and stopped her. I was up all night. This was all under a different username from the one I currently use. Story 3. Holy crap, I have one for this. I had some expired Triscuit crackers. I wanted to know if I could still eat them with some non-expired dip. So I typed it into Google. And one of the top hits is this Shop Savvy site that's all AI generated. But the other hits are similar. Bargain Box, Discover Real Food, and Texas, they're all AI generated blog spam, all built on a very similar template, and all of them are populated with links to other AI generated sites like this. I scraped through a bunch of the links and found that there are more than a dozen different domains in this ring, all linking to each other to game the search results and get top SEO. But I can't figure out why. They aren't running ads and don't have affiliate links. Sourdough Symphony, Trivial Bites, My Kitchen Hacks, Ingredient Savvy, Green Free Goodness, all of them using AI-generated text and images, all of them linking to each other. Eventually, I dug into the owners and figured out that they're linked to a company called Ashfount Investments, but that site is also AI-generated. All the members are stock photos, it's all fake all the way down. All of this to tell me if my Triscuits go bad, seemingly. If anyone has the slightest idea what the purpose behind these sites is, other than contributing further to the internet, please let me know. Story 4. A few years ago, I stumbled into a forgotten corner of the web while trying to find old NASA live stream archives. One link led to a Japanese FTP site that was still online, filled with folders labeled in strange shorthand like STS-115X and Orbital Debrief 1999. Inside were grainy videos and audio logs that seemed real, NASA insignias, launch chatter, and coordinates, but none of the missions matched anything public. Some of the clips even had what looked like internal commentary about visual interference and foreign telemetry signatures. The deeper I dug, the more the timestamps overlapped with actual shuttle missions. Then one day, the whole server vanished, replaced with a 403 error page that had a single blinking underscore in the corner like a command prompt waiting for input. To this day, I've never found anyone who's seen it or heard of it. Even the Wayback Machine skips over it like it was never there. I don't know what I found, maybe some elaborate hoax, but every so often I get the urge to search those mission codes again. Nothing ever comes up, but every few months my search history still shows STS-115X sitting there even when I know I didn't type it. Story 5. Okay, I finally have a place to talk about this. I stumbled upon a YouTube video about an entire family that was basically an inbreeding cesspool. Unbelievable amounts of cruelty of all kinds had been taking place within this family for multiple generations that went on until 2012. It was honestly one of the most disgusting and abhorrent things I'd ever learned about. What's even weirder is, even after this family was discovered, which took decades because they lived out in the middle of nowhere and were isolated from society, multiple family pictures had active Instagram and social media accounts that were public with pictures. Like, I went down an entire rabbit hole of at least 10 to 15 different family members' Instagram accounts. Some even had posts with disturbing comments towards each other. I had the thought that these could have been fake, but it was weird that a lot of the pictures uploaded weren't anywhere else online. It was also already proven that an account on TikTok made by a younger member was legitimate, and everything I was finding myself through these social media accounts was extremely bizarre and sad. It's been a while since I came across this, so I may have a few details backward, but I believe this was the Cult family, and Cult is not their real name. The only reason I went down the rabbit hole of their social media was after finding a random post online that had doxed their real name. The entire thing still feels like a fever dream. It was so disturbing. Story 6. The History of Rosicrucianism. It's fascinating. Basically, some fellow wrote a couple of books in the early 17th century of what we today would call utopian science fiction. It purported to be manifestos describing a secret society of enlightened masters working secretly to create an esoteric science for the betterment of humanity. Needless to say, this was completely invented by the writer, but it found a ready audience of people who very much wanted to believe it was true, and an endless stream of charlatans claiming to be those esoteric masters. Eventually, the authorities in various places became alarmed. The authorities never liked the notion of secret societies expressly working on social change, particularly in an era of religious upheaval, and the manifestos were larded with religious and Kabbalistic ideas. And they started to crack down on these Rosicrucians, which just had the effect of convincing the public that the esoteric masters actually existed. Perhaps the most bizarre and influential outcome, the so-called Invisible College of Thinkers and Scientists in England, was inspired by this, which eventually morphed into the Royal Society with luminaries like Sir Isaac Newton at the helm. In other words, in some ways, simply wishing something to exist actually made something like it exist in reality, as the Royal College had tremendous influence on the actual and not imaginary history of science. It is amazing how much the early participants were into religious mysticism, alchemy, and the like, as well as what we now would call science, Newton in particular. Indeed, originally there was little to differentiate a natural philosopher from a good old-fashioned alchemist or magician or esoteric master, and it is interesting how that separation came to exist, something ongoing in this era, namely that science, as it came to be known eventually, was based on a methodology that emphasized communication of information and repeatable results, rather than hidden or esoteric knowledge, and as a consequence proved to be more useful. The notion of Rosicrucianism also, of course, gave birth to numerous societies bearing that name, all claiming descent from the original manifestos and leaning more on the esoteric and mystic side. Perhaps the original manifestos are truly among the most influential secular works of fiction ever. Story 7. I once spent a long weekend looking into the theory online that rock musician Andrew WK was an industry plant, that he was really a character of an energetic rock star performed by an actor, and that he had been replaced. It didn't help that although he almost always wore his uniform of filthy white shirt and pants, his appearance has varied over the years based on hair and beard length, and that one time years before I had seen pictures of what looked like to be Andrew WK cosplayer at an event and was confused. I've never owned an album of his, and I've only heard a few of his singles. Story 8. Hermit crabs. I don't own or desire to own a hermit crab, but one day I stumbled across hermit crab care information by accident, and I couldn't stop reading. I spent the entire day on this. I eventually ended up on some blog detailing what happened when a guy apparently well known in the hermit crab keeping hobby forums passed away, and how they handled finding care for his massive amount of pet hermit crabs after. The most interesting I learned is that you have to be careful with a hermit crab that has just molted if they're in a tank with multiple hermit crabs. Hermit crabs eat their shed skin to regain the nutrients. If the newly molted crab runs into others while the smell of shed skin is still on it, the others will go, "Oh yay, tasty shed skin," and eat it. They actually make a special scent remover you can wash your crab in to remedy this. Story 6. Man, when I was a teenager, I got so into research chemicals, but without any real access to them. Aside from clonazepam and DXM until university, I would stay up all night reading about stimulants, dissociatives, etc., and because I didn't have access, I just imagined what it was like to be on them. I really got into in my head that using them would make me a better person. Only years later, and after I finally was able to get my hands on a variety of them, did I realize they were an escape, a sort of performative way to be cool and above others. Yeah, right. It did teach me I was good at reading and summarizing research, though, and now I'm a psychologist/CBT therapist. Go figure. Story 10. Godzilla, the history, philosophy, production methods, scripts, actors, etc. I've been in this hole literally as long as I can remember, and I don't see myself getting out anytime soon. The only movies and shows I haven't seen are the ones that were never made, but I found the unfinished scripts and read them online. When you know about Godzilla versus Satan, you're living in this hole now. Story 11. Ancient civilizations. There is basically nothing that can convince me that human life hasn't been almost completely wiped off of the face of the earth multiple times. From the stories of the global floods across basically all of the continents, so many ancient civilizations with stories of their earlier people coming out of the ground after catastrophe. You look at places in India, the wind caves in the Dakotas, there's just too much to deny the fact that there is more or was more going on than we are willing to admit. I rationalize it myself like this: if you're at home and there's a storm or a tornado, you tell your children it's going to be okay, but you never admit how much danger they're in. If the government or quote-unquote deep state knows that we could get wiped out by an asteroid, they would just act like it's not serious, or the probability is very low while preparing to get themselves underground. The regular citizen is never aware of how much jeopardy we are in. Because of course, why would we toe the line and follow the rules if the world could end tomorrow? Story 12. It's been a long time, but way back in the early days of the World Wide Web, around 1997, 98, There was a site called Web Roulette. You'd go to the site, press refresh, and you'd be presented with 5 completely random URLs. Most of them are random documents, the kind of stuff you find on the deep web these days, mostly just data or papers on stuff that anybody not involved would be incredibly confused about, or random business websites, but every once in a while you'd be presented with a hidden gem. One morning in computer class, I clicked refresh and was presented with a link to a site on a web ring, a bunch of sites associated with the same thing and linked together, focused on the jihad to destroy Barney the dinosaur. It was a bunch of stories, poems, text-based RPGs, and original artwork focused around Barney as an evil entity out to destroy our children. One of my personal favorites was a parody of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven called The Barney. It's been almost 30 years and I still swing by from time to time to see if there's new content. Story 13. A girl I went to high school with who was going through a mental health crisis or substance-induced psychosis. She would live stream for hours and the things she would say and do were crazy. I watched everything in shock and horror and got so invested. It went on for months and then she would disappear and come back. It's been silent for about a year now, and I wonder how she's doing. I researched her and found some court records as well. I hope she's getting better. Story 14. I am, without qualification, an old son of a witch, and I can testify that if you have the right kind of mind, you don't need no lame bum internet to fall 1,000 feet into a rabbit hole using a library. The book by A.C. Clarke, titled The Fountains of Paradise, had a rabbit hole bait line that went something like this. On the wall was a picture from Roth's famous classic of Brunel standing in front of the anchored chains of the Great Western. Today, you can type that into Google and duplicate my card catalog search in a single minute. My search in 1980 wandered through the University of Idaho's library and wound up with correspondence with the institutions of civil engineers in the UK. My fall led me to developing probably the most complete collection of literature of the life of the Victorian engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The carbolic acid, powered locomotive, the Great Western, the tunnel under the Thames, a train driven by remote compressed air. I began with Isambard Kingdom Brunel by L.T.C. Rolt and wound up receiving a blueprint elevation of the Royal Albert Bridge at Saltish. I am delighted with falling into rabbit holes. My very first began in 1969 with a hitchhiking road trip to California, rooming in a genuine whorehouse in Long Beach, a tour in Vietnam, a 4-year tour in Germany, and a 18-cent donation to the Imperial War Museum in London. Rabbit holes, my favorite thing in all the world. Story 15. The Sailing Stones of Death Valley. There are a bunch of stones that very slowly move around the desert, leaving cool tracks due to their weight pressing down on the dried mud of the desert. The mechanism of how they move is interesting in its own right. Basically, below freezing temperatures at night cause minute ice crystals to form, and any breeze moves a stone a tiny little bit as this happens, happening again and again every night, adding up to noticeable movement. They move the farthest in winter. The research that discovered all of this is kind of cute. In the 1970s, they decided to figure it out, so they labeled and carefully tracked the exact location of a few dozen of these stones every single day for years. They gave them names. At first, it was Stone A, Stone B, etc., but as the researchers familiarized themselves with the stones, they began to use nicknames for each one instead. Mary, Susan, etc. One of the heaviest, 320 kilograms, Karen, actually got lost at one point. Nobody could find her for a few years, despite how carefully everything was recorded, how heavy Karen was, and how few people frequented the inhospitable area. Plus, people, animals, and vehicles leave tracks in the dry mud, just as the stones famously do. So if someone came and hauled her away in a truck, there would be very clear signs. But no, she just vanished into thin air. How can a great big rock even get lost at all? The researchers were, adorably, really worried and upset until she reappeared later, safe and sound. It's still a mystery what happened to her, but she and the other stones are even more closely monitored now. Nowadays, these stones have GPS units attached and all sorts of fancy cameras to record the infinitesimal movements, but the stones are moving less, and there are concerns that climate change will cause them to ultimately become sedentary like regular rocks. You can feel the sadness of the scientists involved when you read interviews. They care so much about those rocks. The weirdest stuff, by far, is all the bonkers conspiracy theories. People think these stones are proof that aliens built the pyramids, that we're all in a matrix, that invisible angels are basically playing a very slow soccer game, or that underneath there's a subterranean psychic training facility hidden by the government. Story 16. I went down a 2-hour rabbit hole on Yankee Doodle Dandy, a movie about George M. Cohan. The reason for this being I heard vaguely about James Cagney from an elective class, Music of Broadway, during our lesson on George M. Cohan. And being a Cuphead fan, I wanted to see if he was the inspiration for Cagney Carnation. Then I discovered the name Joanne Leslie under his entry. As a Gumball fan, I remembered Cagney as a flower and so is Leslie. And then I proceeded to spend way too much time looking through every name on the Wikipedia page for more names of plant characters. Second place goes to my rabbit holes where I spent so much time researching chromosomal abnormalities because genetics is a big interest of mine. Story 17. I spent a good long time searching for a book that was always brought up on this sub during the scariest books you've ever read threads. When I decided to go to the sub for books like that, I needed to find the original post to show them. And found there isn't a book, but a years-long and multi-sub web of fetish posting about dog breath. I asked real people about that book. I interacted with the guy thinking we were uncovering a lost, creepy book together. A literary version of the evil farming game, if you will. Ended up feeling like the people who learned the game where you secretly play as a kitty fiddler and you help him find a kid was actually real instead. Story 18. Quantum mechanics and physics, its movement in different fields and webs. The movement in a field determines what we call that particle or wave. That light is like lol at time and it's pure kinetic energy, meaning it has no standing mass. My brain is melting with this new information because I'm too stubborn to do the math, but so now I'm like, I can't go any further without at least understanding math. And my brain is melting like, what determines the field? It's like, what? Now, black holes are on my list of things that make my stomach flip thinking about. The list doesn't make sense or have any logic behind it. If you're really curious about my list, it's sea stars, jellyfish, long worms chilling at the bottom of the ocean, geoducks, and some species of mushrooms and otters. So black holes are my newest addition to that list. Story 19. I looked up where the name of a dog, George Banks, I was dog sitting, came from, Mary Poppins, but also found the name shared by someone who had committed a gun incident in the 80s and was under a sentence of termination. 3 hours later, I was still exploring. There's so much information on there about the history of termination, relevant news, moral issues, published research, current and past methods used, scheduled future terminations, and even a database containing everyone in capital confinement and everyone else who has been terminated since 1976. I traipsed over the Wikipedia for a while too, but there's so much to learn on that website listed above. Warning, it may radicalize you. For anyone curious about George Banks, the offender, he was scheduled to be terminated in 2004, but eventually declared mentally incompetent for termination. He had long-standing delusions and paranoia of imminent race wars, and 5 of his 13 victims were his own children, in an attempt to protect them from suffering racial cruelty. He spent the rest of his life in prison and actually passed away of cancer earlier this week. For anyone curious about George Banks, the dog, he was a pretty good boy, but not very affectionate. Or rather, he did not like receiving affection. He snuggled up next to me while I was sleeping and then growled at me when I instinctively pet him. Great at setting boundaries, that guy. For anyone curious about me, I was diagnosed with ADHD a few weeks after this hyper-focused rabbit hole. Story 20. In recent years, probably the Creepshow art drama. If you were terminally online during the COVID just post-lockdown era, you probably heard that a YouTuber was outed for being a 4chan user and a stalker. She'd managed to make a lot of acquaintances in the commentary space, so virtually every commentary YouTuber had to cover it. What you might not know is that this drama was the direct result of another YouTuber, Toby, making a call-out video on Creepshow art over a year. Prior to that, snowballed into several dramas that were all interconnected. Toby's call-out video was actually alright, but it turned out to be a fleeting moment of rationality for her, as she was deeply volatile and reactionary otherwise. Even so, she can't have foreseen how that video indirectly led to Creepshow actually being exposed as a stalker. Cecile McFly was also a very helpful video condensing the entire 2 or so years' worth of nonsense, and if any of you have 4 hours to spare or need some low-stakes nonsense to listen to while you're working, there you go. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 21. I used to work nights at a low workload job, so when I got done what I needed to do, I'd just sit there for hours and research rock bands, then research which bands inspired them, read all the articles and interviews I could find, and just get deeper and deeper into it. This was around 2009, 2010, pre-Spotify, the early days of YouTube, so it was a lot of more of a treasure hunt. Found a lot about cool music and obscure articles, local university shows from huge names that were up-and-comers at the time, GeoCities and Yahoo fan sites, stuff that may or may not even exist outside of the Wayback Machine anymore. Story 22. Watching lots of videos from two different schizophrenic YouTubers who also each accidentally had some good ASMR qualities to their voices and presentations. One was called The Groxed and The Groxed 1, and later the Groxed Alpha Omega. The core of his content had a lot of the typical "the Illuminati are satanic and here's all the signs and symbols they put in front of us to tell us what's going on and what they're going to do" stuff. But what he also did a lot was pull up different places on Google Earth and then trace out really silly looking childlike doodles on it, and then explain how these doodles represent the way the end of the world is going to play out. What really made me interested in him, though, is how peacefully relaxed he was in all of his videos explaining this stuff. Like, if you pictured the stereotypical screaming homeless man while reading my description of him, I wouldn't blame you a bit. But no, instead, he sounded like a really smart, chill tour guide for nature walks, all while explaining nuclear holocaust and the Book of Revelation. Unfortunately, I haven't found anything made by him for at least 3 years now, so I can't help but wonder if he's gone now. The other one was Lord Stephen Christ, and he was way more interesting and insane. He claimed to be Jesus because, of course, he did, and his main topic was showing how the world and the whole universe as well were actually all concave. Like, we don't live on the Earth, we live in the Earth, and outer space, well, actually, it's inner space, and all of inner space is contained in a glass ball above us, which is the center of the Earth and the universe. And when you watch the sunrise, you're actually watching the sunset and vice versa. And most of his videos were explaining how this is possible despite literally everything that says otherwise. But as insane as he was, he also had an unbelievable knack for ASMR from both his voice and his drawing skills, which were also pretty good, to the point where it made me kind of sad sometimes that he clearly had real talent at drawing and grasping a lot of scientific concepts, only to have it all be upended and ruined by an illness I'm sure he couldn't really help. Unfortunately, Chris was also more on the stereotypically crazy side of things compared to the Groxed. He was put in prison back around 2010 for threatening Obama and then in 2018 for threatening Trump. Both threats, though, I think were done because they wouldn't recognize my authority, because he's Jesus and all. And then back in 2020, or was it 21, he passed away in prison from a respiratory infection. Story 23. I was weirdly engrossed in the case of the guy that ended his wife and 2 daughters, Chris Watts. Based on the evidence in the initial few months, I thought he did, but I argued there was a chance his story of his wife ending the girls was also true. Well, he definitely later confessed he ended them all, and any gray area I was arguing was out the window, so I had spent months uselessly speculating in defense of this horrible person. Super cool. I think I was biased because I was a new father at the time and could not even fathom ever harming my kids as a dad. Pretty cringe when I look back on it, even if my motive was finding the truth. Story 24. When I was like 14, 15, I was super into looking into paranormal videos and sites. It was like my final magic might be real fascination. I'd watch hours of footage and get duped into the analysis, telling me that because of those pixels, there's no way this could be faked. It's a real ghost, and then going through the ideas of how, if ghosts are real, what are they? Are they literal spirits we all have that walk the earth after we pass away? Are they moments captured in time somehow? Are they people from our own dimensions and timelines slipping through the universe? I grew out of it after exploring abandoned hospitals and such once I could drive, and also realizing that if a real ghost was ever captured on film, it would be talked about everywhere, and all the modern world has too many cameras, there's no way there would be zero provable evidence at this point. I still like to go on ghost tours and explore abandoned, haunted mansions. I enjoy the atmosphere even though I know there will never be actually a ghost. Story 25. Rocky Flats, Colorado, where they assembled plutonium buttons and they keep building near it. People from out of state buy homes and raise their kids there. Dust blows all around on windy days. I tell people to look into it, and they act like I'm crazy. Mother's Day 1969 is the wildest part. Read about 2 guys left to try to put out a radioactive fire when the ceiling was mushrooming and everyone was on vacation for the day. It was being disassembled in 99, 2000 when I first moved out there. I watched the slow-moving trains pass my house weekly in a tiny mountain town. My house 40 feet from the train tracks. We are making a problem someone else's by taking the contaminated buildings and soil to the storage facility in Clive, Utah. Nobody speaks of it or knows about it that has moved here in the last 10 to 15 years, like radioactive half-lives aren't a thing. Plutonium leaked, a lot of it. They stored it in open, contaminated barrels stacked across the plains, wind whipping over the Rockies and carrying it east. A giant contaminated lake is where local schools take children on field trips. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,100 years, so only 24,050 years to go. Story 26. Remember the Bundy Ranch? Ranchers who let their cattle roam free onto their people's land, and it was interfering with the establishment of a prototype solar energy project? And it ended with some of the Bundys taking over a nature observatory and having to be stormed. I ended up reading about the solar project and found posted online company reports revealing the project was to be funded by tax dollars put into operation and then sold to big-name energy company bidders after a couple of years, if I recall correctly. It was a complete scam. I ended up finding there were some played-out mineral deposits on the Bundy property and wondered if the government had an interest in it, and that the endangered tortoises on that land were going to be removed to some extent, with some flippantly relocated. There's a lot more. This is my strong ADHD with autistic spectrum sprinklings at work. None of it ended up mattering at all. Wasted time. Story 27. The problems with generic medication. I've read probably every news article, scientific paper, study, FDA report, MedWatch report, and know way too much about it. ProPublica has an excellent series if you're interested. The U.S. is entirely reliant on Indian and Chinese generic pharmaceutical manufacturers. The FDA oversaw and wanted this shift and has completely failed to regulate these manufacturers. They've banned plans from importing pharmaceuticals into the U.S. and then given the same manufacturers exceptions to still sell those pharmaceuticals to Americans to avoid shortages. Americans have passed away, people have gone blind or had other serious complications due to contaminated pharmaceuticals. We don't even have a list of what pharmaceuticals, manufacturers, or plants have been banned but still are allowed to be sold to us. Generic pharmaceuticals do not have to go through the same approval process as brand name pharmaceuticals, and they don't have to use the same ingredients. The active ingredient has to be the same, but the filler, capsule, etc. can be different and can affect the efficacy of the pharmaceutical. Even when widespread complaints have been made, the FDA has covered it up. Story 28. Dungeons and Dragons. D&D is not even a common thing in my country. I've never known anyone who plays it. One random day, I downloaded a D&D video game that can't remember which one though, but before playing, I thought, hey, I feel like I never really understood these rules. What is a sword 1d6? Why is a magic sword just +1? That feels like crap. In Diablo 2, my sword deals like a quintillion amount of damage, and why the heck do I miss my attacks so much, and so on. So I looked up some tutorials on YouTube. I found it pretty interesting, and I was interested in more. Found out some random dudes playing D&D on stream and gave it a shot. Grave mistake. I couldn't stop watching. And that's how I watched like 500 plus hours of Critical Role. My web browser was so full of stuff about D&D, books, resources, map generators, campaigns, ideas, music for ambience, sketches, and a lot of stuff like that. I even made a campaign for some friends and we played it online. It was great, but they weren't that much into it. So after maybe 4 or 5 sessions, they started making excuses or just not showing any interest in it. Then I didn't play anymore for the past 5 years probably. I hope to find a nice group to do it someday. Story 29. People talking about, I spent 6 hours reading about, or once I ended up being fascinated with X for 3 days. We have different conceptions of rabbit hole depth. When I was 19, returning from the military, I worked in a hospital while living in a small room apartment with only a mattress and a table. I started getting philosophy books. At any one time on the floor, there would be 20 plus books opened and placed face down, so I could pick up and keep reading from the place it was open to. Slowly, I stopped coming to the job. I just stayed home and read. Then I started going to the library. Since I was jobless, I would also run out of money. I left the apartment behind and became homeless. I did that for 7-ish years. Never quite found the bottom of that rabbit hole. Story 30. A frequent and insightful commentator at the Skeptical OB once mentioned having been in a cult, so I visited her website about it. So she was in a 2-person, sometimes 3-person cult where the leader believed themselves to be the reincarnation or avatar of Frodo, Elijah Wood, and it kind of spiraled from there. This included trying to host a fan convention to which at least a few LOTR actors showed up. But otherwise, nothing was organized and was generally awful for everyone. They also went busking as Disney characters in LA, all while being convinced that they were saving the world from destruction. And finally, the commenter extricated herself, and as of the last post, the cult leader had developed a new cult around the HP fanfic Dumbledore's Army, with apparently a whole lot of vulnerable teenagers, so I'm sure that ended well. Story 31. The biggest rabbit hole I've ever been on was this past summer. I saw a post on here with a picture about air tanks of divers who had lost their lives in Jacob's Well in Texas. So I dove into the comments, and among many intriguing comments, one commenter wrote an absolutely horrifying first-person depiction of what it's like to perish in a cave diving scenario. A week or two later, and every piece of internet content I consumed was about cave diving. I had no interest in actually diving myself, but learning about the deepest cave divers became my obsession. I capped it off with watching a fantastic documentary, free on YouTube, called Dave Not Coming Back. It was absolutely gripping, and I highly recommend it. Story 32. Danny Cosolero and the Octopus. Utterly impossible to summarize, but he was a journalist who was terminated in 1991 while investigating a piece of software that was developed for the government, stolen, and used to spy all over the world. There are many shady incidents connected to the case. In 2017, Cosolero's remaining papers, the ones not stolen from his hotel room, were uploaded to archive.org. Being able to read his own handwritten investigation notes was quite an experience. I've spent many hours since then reading about it. I eventually found out that the man who uploaded the papers was researching the case for a documentary. It's now on Netflix. They do a great job with it. I still think about it pretty much every day. Story 33. When I was around 17, I got into this website where you could either listen to someone's problems or have someone listen to your problems. I decided to try it out, listening. It was late on a school night and I had an exam the next morning. Instead of sleeping, I ended up staying awake until 2 a.m. trying to talk a young kid out of ending it all. It was so intense. There were moments where it felt very touch and go, and the feeling of responsibility in those times was so heavy. Things ended up okay, and when we ended the session on a positive, the relief was incredible. Since then, I have so much more respect for anyone who has ever worked on a crisis line. Story 34. A UPS driver told me about a commune about a mile north of my previous house in the woods. Sure enough, I looked up the area and found a bunch of interesting street names, celestial in nature. I came to find out an internationally known leader of a UFO cult lives up there. The same UPS driver also told me that he often delivered to a ranch that now houses some of the animals from Michael Jackson's estate. If I'm not mistaken, there was an elephant, maybe a giraffe, and at least one zebra. The zebra would sometimes escape, and photos ended up in a local Facebook group. After going down that rabbit hole for a bit, I also found out about a weird tiger yoga cult to the east that's connected to other centers in the area. All of their websites have the same pyramid displayed in a corner. There was a church at the end of my street. The previous pastor of that church was my next door neighbor and told me that the building was sold to some sort of weird internet cult. Sure enough, I looked them up, and the new pastor basically had a bunch of propaganda saying that people who didn't follow him ended up mysteriously passing away. We rarely saw people at the church for the years we lived there, but we did occasionally see people wearing New Age, shiny, weird-looking capes in the parking lot. Oregon can be a weird place to live sometimes. Story 35. Trying to understand narcissists, as in people with narcissistic personality disorder. I've just always been around them, no matter where I go, all the while not being able to relate at all to their crazy thinking. I was raised by one and grew up asking why a lot. It turns out he was not as bad as it gets. Try getting jobs with more certifications than most people have, and they really come out. People you don't even know want to get you fired. And even weirder, many people are very susceptible to being flying monkeys. Basically, people who might have been nice but are hardwired to be mindless sheep that narcissists can easily control. I imagine these are the people that are vulnerable to cults. My current job would be awesome if it wasn't for my narcissistic boss who sometimes says he doesn't have empathy, etc. My research has really helped me understand their tactics. I suspect about 10% of everyone is a narcissist and about 50% of everyone is a follower. Story 36. There was a guy who posted chapters of his book on r/writing. They were always just super wild, and he talked about things that were bonkers. I ended up going through his profile, seeing him get more and more delusional. I check him out every single day until finally he stopped posting. Then out of nowhere, like 6 months later, I see him comment on something and it's some nonsense again. I said something like, "Hey dude, did you recently stop taking your meds or just get out of the hospital?" He PM'd me thinking I was some government psyop or wondering how I knew he stopped taking his meds. I told him no, I followed his Reddit account and I think he might be in the midst of having another episode. He stopped posting again. I eventually deleted that account, so I can't even check since I forgot his username. I hope he's still on his medication. Story 37. Maybe not a rabbit hole, but a short, funny story. Back in the day when dial-up was a thing and the internet was sparkly new, I was looking up Winnie the Pooh themed stuff. I wanted to print out paper with characters in the corner to make myself a little bit of stationery. Black and white, of course. We weren't fancy enough to have a color printer. While searching, because Google wasn't a thing yet, I found something that no person should accidentally come across: Winnie the Pooh characters in every position known to man. We had one computer in a one-story house. This was my dad's computer. He could have walked by or into the den at any moment. Needless to say, I was freaked out because I didn't want to get caught, lol. Story 38. Too many to count, lol. I often have some random bit of information that I'll share with my coworkers. They're always asking me to go down different rabbit holes to find information now. I have to say that Mormons is the deepest dive though. I'll spend days researching and reading all kinds of weird things, but I spent over a month deep diving into Mormons every single day, just episode after episode on Spotify. I'd go home and research more things about them. I still find myself digging into it sometimes. My partner was so over me talking about Mormons that he would leave the room if I started talking about them or just completely tune me out. If you're interested in learning about Mormons, check out the podcast Someplace Underneath. They've done a solid deep dive and can really answer so many questions you might have. Story 39. I bought a tent for a camping trip and was watching YouTube videos looking for practical tips about pitching tents. I found one really useful one about putting away a similar tent to mine, not a polished modern video, but a proper homemade video from the early days of YouTube. So I went through the guy's other videos to see if he had any more useful tips. His only other videos were several unedited videos from his wife's 50th birthday party, a proper, stereotypical British party in a church hall with a hired DJ, and a bunch of family members dancing away to Wigfield's Saturday Night and similar. I watched them for way too long. It was like an intimate, nostalgic little slice of life. Story 40. Reading about plane crash investigations, it's also why the show Mayday is a guilty pleasure of mine. Strangely, the more I read about plane crashes and investigations, the more I appreciate how safe modern commercial aviation is. Not because things never go wrong. In fact, things go wrong all the time, but for something catastrophic to occur, there usually needs to be multiple things going wrong at the same time. It actually makes me wish that the same level of analysis, logic, and rigor applied to crash investigations could be applied to other problems in society. Story 41. Not the internet, but my family got really into watching sumo wrestling on the NHK Japan channel. We began talking about their strategies and weight classes, learned about the rituals involved with the game and the culture around it. It was really fun. One time there was a young sumo going against someone about 100 pounds heavier than him. We said, no way he's gonna win. He just entered the championship, has no wins, and is so small. But he won. He became our favorite. We kept track of how he progressed through the season. I wish I could remember his name. Story 42. When I was working as a writer, I was covering topics related to prisoners in the USA and their rights, think whether they can receive mail, marry in prison, etc. One of the topics specifically was dating/pen pal apps for prisoners, and there were several websites I was supposed to explore. It turned out, I didn't really know this, as I'm not American, that they actually have their profiles with pictures, their likes and dislikes, dating preferences, etc., so people can choose a prisoner, write them letters, or potentially date them. You could also see what crime they committed, and, well, I started scrolling and checking out each and every profile, guessing what crime a person committed before I checked it. Not gonna lie, it was fun. I almost chose a pen pal myself, lol. Another time, I somehow ended up on the website of a particular Texas prison where there was the entire list of all the prisoners on death row from the 1950s until now. For every person, you could see the entire file, reports about the crime, a description of what they did, their last meals, last wishes, and last words. As interesting as it was also so depressing. And my masochistic self spent hours looking at these reports. I even forgot why I was exploring in the first place, LMAO. Story 43. I was on archive.org and was perusing a collection related to a county, town in Illinois. They had first grade class photos from 1965, and I saw a little girl who looked out of place. She was a lone Hispanic child in a sea of Anglo faces, and I thought, what brought her family to that area and how did her life turn out? So I began to see if I could find anything about her through Google, etc. I obviously only had her family name and not a surname she may have in a future marriage, so I had to look through obituaries that would mention maiden names. I found some with the same name, but most were in Texas, and I could find no link between there and early life in Illinois. Also, none of the possible people I investigated look anything like the girl in question, and I admitted defeat. And if any of these stories got to you too, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. I'll catch you in that video.
Well, I'm glad I I came here because we